Hi, and welcome. My name is Sophia Michaelis.
And I'm Alex Kahn.
And we are going to work with you today and explain how to build a lantern for Morningside Lights, which you can do at home. Morningside Lights is a procession of lanterns that gives light and life to a certain story, an idea, a theme.
Since we can't gather together for a parade in the park, our thought was that people will create these lanterns at home with the kits that you all have, and on a certain night, we're all going to go out into our respective neighborhoods, just in our local areas, keeping safe distance, and share the work that we've created with our immediate communities. But all of those lanterns will be linked by a common theme. We searched long and hard for a theme that might speak to the moment that we're in. And we started looking at sort of a touchstone of the Harlem Renaissance, the work of Langston Hughes. We hit on this one particular poem called Harlem Night Song. And a lot of these poems that Hughes wrote were sort of a striving for joy against a backdrop of tragedy, loss, hardship, a lot of the things that people have been going through during the last year. So we thought this particular poem was really appropriate for us all to work together around a central theme. And the way that we're going to do that is that each of you will find in your packet that you have a complete copy of the poem, but there'll be one section of the poem that's highlighted. And that is going to be your phrase, your fragment of the greater poem that you are going to give light and life to. And the lanterns, they're what we call sort of 2.5 dimensional, sort of a sandwich of light colored on both sides. And at the bottom of each lantern will be a little marquee, and on that marquee will be your phrase. So the collective result of this is that when all of these lanterns come out, the entire poem will be sort of out there in the ether and there for people on the street to experience in whatever neighborhood they may be wandering.
Keep in mind that it will probably take you a few days, not full days of work, but at least a few hours a day over the course of a few days so that you allow for drying time and also really enjoy the process.
So each of you has one of these handy kits. The main ingredient of these lanterns, the main structural ingredient, is this material coroplast, which is like a milky kind of a milk jug sort of plastic. In addition to the coroplast, you're going to have small supports to kind of create the structural part of the lantern so that it's three-dimensional. Some clear packing tape, various kinds of glue. We have Elmer's glue, and we also have Elmer's art paste, which is basically papier-maché glue. You'll also have some basic tools, a 2-inch brush, a retractable knife for cutting the coroplast, a marker for doing your fragment of text on what we're calling the marquee below, and a little bit of wire for hanging. You'll also have this mini LED light, which will illuminate the whole lantern. And then we also have some cheesecloth for covering the sides of the lantern. The most important part is that you'll have a whole range of colored tissue paper, as well as a base color of white. And these colors are basically so that the light can shine through the inside of the lantern. And then the last thing you'll find in your kit, or outside of your kit, as the case may be, is this piece of bamboo, which will be used to carry your lantern out into public space. You should be able to do a lantern completely just with those materials, but there are a few other things that you will find really helpful to have with you for this process. Pencil and paper, so that you can draw out some ideas, work through some sketches, old containers for mixing the different glues that we're using. And for mixing the papier-maché, it's really helpful to have an egg beater or a whisk. Also very useful to have a pair of scissors. Finally, you're going to want to prepare your workspace. So this process can be a little bit messy. We're also doing some cutting with a blade into a surface. So you don't want to mar your kitchen tabletops or your counters. You want to make sure you have something protecting whatever work surface you're working on.
The first thing you want to do is to come up with an idea. Often people say, oh, I don't know how to draw. And it's not about knowing how to draw. It really is about translating an idea into a visual form. The drawing that we decided on doing is across the Harlem rooftops. It has details, but it's sort of a bold and simple image. You want to remember that your lantern will be seen, by people walking by. They're not necessarily going to go and see all of the tiny details. So remember, kind of try to essentialize an idea, make it a nice, strong image, but the overall image should be simple. When you're thinking about the lantern, remember that it will be an illuminated piece in the night. You don't have to create the night sky. You will be in the night sky. There's a lot going on here, but actually the outline of the lantern is simple. Don't create a complicated situation for your future self by designing something that has like long whiskers coming out. Like, that's not going to work. Think of it as a form that's contained, that it'll be pretty simple to cut out, but also will have a nice profile, a nice silhouette. Remember, all of these pieces, all of these lanterns are going to come together and recreate the entire poem. So we want to be able to see the text clearly and consistently with the other lanterns. So let's keep it a white band in the bottom. Just allow yourself to dream a little bit. This is kind of the openness. Read the full poem. It could have, your ideas might have something to do with a larger poem based on the fragment that you have, or maybe you take your fragment and it kind of goes in a different direction from Langston Hughes's poem. So once you've gone through your design process and you've come up with a final concept with your collaborators or with your internal collaborators, if you're just collaborating with yourself, you have a drawing. It's a strong image. It clearly illustrates it. It illustrates the fragment of text. Now I'm going to draw it. So I'm just going to start with my marquee, and I know that that's about 5 inches. If you have your spacers handy, these are also 5 inches. So you don't have to exactly measure, but you could kind of eyeball it. I'm going to do mine a little bit swooping, a little bit like a ribbon. Give it a nice motion. And then I have a building that comes out, and I want to get the outline. I don't need to draw all of the buildings that are on the inside. I don't need to draw all that detail because I'm going to cover it with various layers of cheesecloth and white tissue paper. So I'll bury all that detail if I draw it out. But sometimes it's helpful to draw out a little bit in case, just as reference, so while I draw, I make sure that my proportions are correct. So I'm not going to draw necessarily all of the internal details. So now we have the outline of our lantern drawn out. We did draw a little bit on the inside. It was helpful as reference. So now we're going to draw with a knife, and we're going to cut out the outline of the coroplast. A few safety precautions. Every time you cut, figuring out where your body is, where your hand that is not cutting is. So, don't cut towards your hand. At every point, I'm careful about where my hand is and where the knife is going and where my body is. And the reason I said drawing with a knife is that the first pass that we'll do onto our outline is we're going to score it. We're not going to try to cut all the way through. We're going to cut through the top layer of the plastic. Applying some pressure, and it's sort of hopping from flute to flute, but I'm not really pushing it down. As I'm getting to that corner, I'm going to put the knife right at the edge and then meet up with the line I was drawing. It's hardest when you're going kind of against the flutes, so it requires a little bit more pressure. And I'm going to cut this nice wave, which goes all the way to the bottom. And once you have scored the entire outline, and now I'm going to go over those same lines and then apply a little more pressure, but my knife has a nice channel, a groove that it can go in. So 2 or 3 passes on the shape that you're doing, and then you get it cut out. We have 1 piece cut, but we need 2 pieces cut to create our light sandwich, to create both sides of the lantern. So now I'm gonna take the lantern that I cut, I'm gonna place it over the other one. So you line up your form, take your handy pencil, and you just trace your image. So then I have an outline, and I will score it all over again, and then you will have an exact replica of your original cutout.
Okay, so we have now two identical cutouts. And what we're going to do now is, if you think of these lanterns as being containers of light, we need to make that space. And we're going to do that with the same material, with these coroplast spacers. And we're going to work our way around the outside of this form with little strips of tape. And what I'm looking for is there going to be about 12 points where we want to have little columns of coroplast sticking up to support the second form. So what that looks like is I'm going to be looking at spots where maybe there are corners where it needs a little extra support. So for example, right here on this corner, I may lay in a little piece of tape, and I may do one alongside here. So your form is going to be different from this one, obviously. So you just have to think just an equal distribution of about a dozen little pieces of coroplast sticking up. Now these are all cut in a nice stack. You can just separate them. And what you're going to do to start with is lay it down on the edge there and sort of tug on this. Give it a good solid pull so that you're connecting your first little support column. And then you can just kind of let it flop over. You don't have to worry about it for now, and you can work your way around. There are 2 points on this lantern where you want to make sure that you have a pair of those little supports. And that would be at the bottom where your pole is going to come out, and at the top where it's going to emerge and be hooked onto the lantern. And I'm going to sort of figure out where's the center line of my lantern, and I'm going to leave a couple of inches on either side of that. So I've got a gap of, maybe 2 or 3 inches there. And again, I'll pick up my tape, lay down my coroplast column here, and then I can just let that flop down for now. And I will work my way around, eventually getting to the top. But you don't have to be super precise here. You just need a little bit of a space for later on when we want to run that pole through. So now I have support at the bottom, at the top. I'm going to want to add some support on the sides. One of the things that we often talk about when we're building processional structures like lanterns or giant puppets is many weak things working together make a strong thing. So this is the first of many weak things we're going to put on this lantern that collectively will make it very strong in the end. And remember, you only have 12 of these in your kit, so you also want to use them, strategically. Okay. So now our goal is to lay this form on top and bring all these columns up and then tape them into place. Now that seems like a rather daunting prospect. It's going to be all wobbly and unwieldy. So what I found was very helpful is you take a stack of books or bricks or a box of cereal, whatever it takes to more or less equal the height of the spacers. And now I'm going to lay this right on top, and I'm going to make sure before I do this that there's a spot I can slide those books out of at the end of the process. So you're going to want to make sure that your top form and your bottom form are perfectly aligned. And you can do that by eye, but it's also helpful to have a little box or a container nearby, something that allows you to just kind of slide it up so that you get that nice right angle all the way around. And this is also a great place where if you're working together as a family, having one person really hold the form secure while somebody else does the taping can be really helpful. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to bring my column and I'm going to put my piece of tape right on the edge of that column, and I'm going to tuck it under the lantern. So we're making a sandwich. We don't want the bologna sticking out of the sandwich. We want it between the 2 slices of bread. I'm going to do a little bit on the bottom, a little bit on the top, a little bit on the side, get them all into place. So now I can carefully slide out my books and tip this up. And it's already pretty strong, robust form. So the next thing that we're going to do for this, obviously, we are coloring these surfaces, but we're also going to want to do designs on the sides. And that's something that in your design you're going to want to think about. What we've done in years past in Morningside Lights is that we've incorporated a technique using cheesecloth and glue. What cheesecloth does is it creates a really nice tacky surface for paper to adhere to. As it dries, it kind of shrinks a little bit, so it makes this beautiful smooth texture. If you have a nice like building edge there and you really want that to show, take a little bit of tape and make yourself a nice bridge. So that way the cloth will come down and it has something to rest on, and then it goes down again, creating a really sharp contour. Before we actually start gluing the cheesecloth on, I'm going to show you every one of your kits is going to have 2 yards of cheesecloth. So what you're going to do is cut sections of this that are just a few inches more on each side than the gap that you want to fill. And I'm just going to take my scissors and cut, and I'm going to cut a few more pieces. So we're going to start with 3. I can always cut more. What we're going to do is unravel or unfold the cheesecloth. Find the edges, unfold, and unfold again, so that you just have one thickness there that's about 3 feet long. Now you have this lovely diaphanous, flexible piece of fabric. I'm just going to lay that down like that. We're going to use Elmer's glue, 1 part glue to 1 part water. I'm going to remind you of one thing right now, which is that when you're done with this glue, you're going to have some left over. Hold on to it, because you're going to need it to mix the papier-mâché later on. So what's left over from this process will be useful in the next process. So now I take my 2-inch brush, and I'm just going to really mix this thoroughly. And there we go. The easiest way to do this is to glue the fabric to the places where it will stick, and then sort of adjust it as you go, little by little. And once it's sort of placed, then we're going to add a little more glue to fill in all of the gaps. I'm going to just paint the sides a little bit, and I'm also going to paint over these spacers. So these are sort of like places where the fabric can stick on its first pass. Now I'm going to take my single piece. I'm just going to reach up to my top spacer there, and I'm going to work my way down in sequence. I'm just letting the fabric stretch out as I go. When I get to a corner, I'm going to make sure that I pull in enough slack so that I get a corner and not just like a slope. It's very forgiving material. It's not going to glue down right away, so you have lots of time to play around with this. So now what I'm going to do is go back in to make sure my sides are really secure. So I'm now using quite a bit more glue. So you want to just really saturate that. Okay, so now I've got the sides really well secured, and now I'm going to re-soak my little bridge points here, including where I have that extra bit of tape. And then the last part of this is sort of like walking the tightrope. You're going to use a lot of glue, but you're going to press very, very lightly with the brush. You don't want this part to sag or sink. And I'm going to just very gently lay in some glue on top of that. It's okay if it drips through the holes. It's going to definitely lose some of the glue, but enough of it will stick so that this becomes a nice, lightweight, stiff skin that will become the sort of structural base onto which we'll do the next stage, which is white paper. To continue this process, we have a little bit of leftover cheesecloth there. Just repeat the same thing that I did with the first piece. And then my next piece can actually overlap the first piece by a few inches so that they can stick to each other. And then I'll just work my way down just like I did with the earlier piece, making sure I'm getting into all of those contours, stretching it as I go. Just double check that I got a nice corner there, a nice corner there. Continue with the sides, and then do the same process all the way through. Now remember, we made this little opening eventually for the pole to go through. For now, you can go right over that. Don't worry about that opening. We're going to worry about that later on when everything is dry. You'll definitely want to set this aside in a safe, clean spot and let it completely dry before the next step.
The first thing we'll want to do is to mix our papier-mâché. You have your box of art paste. This is, a used half-gallon milk container. 2 of those per box of powder is creates the consistency that you want. So I'm going to pour 1/2 gallon into my bucket, another 1/2 gallon, And now I'm gonna start just kind of sort of massaging the powder into the water, and with my whisk, working it in. So it's gonna take you a little while to do this, but better go slow and have a nice smooth paper mache. And then this is where you can take the rest of your cheesecloth glue and pour it in. Give it a last little mix, and then let my glue sit for 10-15 minutes, and you'll see it'll get a little, it'll thicken up over the next 10-15 minutes. In your kit, you have about 9 pieces of white paper. What we do is we tear the paper. Paper has a grain. It tends, these sheets will be happier tearing in this direction than in that direction. With the paper, you can tear a few long pieces. It'll now start tearing at the same angle. Those pieces you can sort of tear. You have to give it a little bit more of a pull. And they will be uneven pieces. Which is fine. It'll be actually nice for the paper mache to have some variation. It's actually better, it'll make stronger paper mache if we use the ragged edges. So now you have a nice stack of white paper and a much thickened bucket of paper mache mix with some Elmer's glue. So I'm going to give it a little bit of a final mix with my brush. I'm going to dip my brush. I'm going to take off some of the excess, but I'm leaving a fair amount of glue on my brush. Gently coat some glue, just like when I was applying the cheesecloth. I'm going to sort of pre-glue an area on the sides as well. I'm getting into the weave. I'm getting into those nooks and crannies because it's very important to have a good layer of glue underneath the paper. Now I'm going to take one of my pieces, put it on a little bit on the side and then a little bit on the front, gently paint the glue on, and the piece of paper will sort of disappear. And then I'm going to take another piece, and I want to generously overlap. It's nice if it's a little bit of a random crisscross, make the lantern a little stronger. Pretend you're shingling a roof with tissue paper. You also want to make sure that as you're working, you're picking up one piece of paper at a time. If you're folding over and you end up having wrinkles, that's okay. You can brush them down flat. Your biggest enemy during this process is air bubbles. So you want to make sure that you go over everything that you're doing and make sure that it's totally flat. So I would recommend just starting as a guide of just kind of doing the sides all the way around and folding over. And when you've done that, you can then do exactly the same thing on the front. Brush the glue on. That's really where it disappears. But I can still see it. And I can kind of remember what area I've been working on. So you can work around the whole area. You don't need to wait for an area to dry to turn the lantern around. It might be helpful when I'm letting it dry or when I'm moving it around to use these scraps of coroplast to kind of rest some of the areas. So you can kind of slowly rotate your entire lantern, do both sides.
So now is the moment of truth. You have your blank canvas here, this beautiful white lantern. It's pretty strong. It's nice to have at least a little bit of a pencil map of where things are going to go. So what I like to do is I'll start just by making sure, in this case, since that marquee is so important, that we've highlighted that marquee. You know, working from my drawing, I might say, okay, let's get some of those buildings sketched in. And, you know, eventually I'll sort of sketch in all of the reference points that I need to have essentially a blueprint or a map for color. So, I didn't sketch in every single detail, and I'm certainly going to allow myself to improvise a little bit. I can now start laying layers of color onto the forms that I've drawn out. So now, before we start applying paper to the lantern, we should talk a little bit about how to work with this paper, because it's a little bit different from painting with a brush. We never use paint for these lanterns, because paint actually blocks the light, whereas tissue paper layered on with papier-maché actually lets the light come through. So because you don't really know what colors are going to do when they're backlit, when there's actually light coming from behind them and shining through them, it's handy to use your spare pieces of coroplast to do some tests. And also you may want to see what happens when you overlap a color once or even twice. So I have this handy dandy light here. Look at that range of values you get. The bottom here is just one layer, the middle is 2 layers, and the top is 3. Notice also where they overlap, you get these really nice shadows. This paper has one quality that is really very important. You can see how straight it tears. If you need thinner strips, you can do that as well. If you want to be even more precise, but still you want to have that soft deckled edge, you can also press really hard down on a straight edge and give it a little tug. Scissors is another really easy way to manipulate this. So if, for example, you're cutting the roof of your water towers, you can actually lay this right over the form that you want and draw right on the paper. And then I'll just take my scissors and cut that form out. So I would say, use the scissors where they're helpful, but don't feel like you have to do this entire thing with each little pane of each little window cut out with scissors. Now, when you tear this paper in other directions, it's not going to tear so straight. So if we tear against the grain, you're just going to get patches. And those patches can be useful as well. So for example, if you're filling in a big side of a building, you might want to have that overlapping texture of many small pieces coming together to sort of create almost like a stuccoed, dappled edge. That's kind of one clue about how to work with paper. I'm going to show you one other technique that is a traditional way of working with tissue paper. And that's if you happen to have a small brush, you can also use the brush as a cutting device. So if I make a little curve, like so, my kidney-shaped piece of pink here, I can just pull away at the moistened edge. And so that allows a much looser hand than cutting something with scissors. And it also allows that soft feathered edge for it to blend with other forms. If I want to just make a little corner, and I want it to be a soft corner, I can just do that. Go all the way to the edge here. Let it sit for a second. Hold it down firmly and peel it away. And there's my soft edge of a building. Every time you add a color to this lantern, it is going to take light away, which means if you do a layer of blue and you want to do a yellow stripe over it, that yellow is going to disappear because the heavier blue will block out the light and there won't be enough light to get through the yellow. So if you want to have light areas, whether it be the moon or a glowing window, you have to sort of plan those things ahead. Let's say I'm thinking about my dark blue sky. We have this lovely midnight blue here. And I'll take a little piece of paper, and I'm going to take a little bit of glue. And let's say I want to have my night sky with some stars. And I lay this down. And what we're going to do is essentially apply this the same way we applied the white paper. Just a bottom layer of glue, piece of paper, and then a top layer of glue. And now I have the idea that I want to add some stars. So I'm going to take my yellow paper. Now if this were acrylic paint, you'd let that dry, and then you just put in some stars, and it would be oh so lovely. But watch what happens here. They sort of disappear, and if you hold that up to any kind of light, you'll see they're essentially gone. So what's a better way to do it? To create a field of light color. And any of you who have ever done printmaking are probably familiar with this process of laying down the light colors first. And then, where you want to have stars, you're going to have to create openings. Lay them on top. And now, the light is going to be able to emerge. So in other words, whether it be windows or stars in the sky or a street light, that light has to be laid down first. So I may start something like this just with the yellow background, because I know from my color tests that the yellow combined with the pink makes a lovely kind of ambery glow. And I'm going to tear a few pieces. And notice I'm just kind of tearing them at random, but if I do have a straight line, I'll probably take advantage of that. Often it's a little bit like building a stone wall where you kind of look for the pieces that fit the thing that you want to do. And I'll kind of use my drawing as a guideline. So what I'll do is I'll just lay in a little bit of glue and lay it down along the edge there. And I'm going to give it a final coat on top. This is exactly the same technique we used for laying the white down. And again, like with the white, it's important that you have a really good base layer of glue before you lay your tissue paper down. So this yellow is really just a starting base color for me. It's just a ground, and where I don't do anything else, I'll have nice glowing yellow windows. But where I add to it, it will start to come to life with other color combinations. And already the windows are sort of taking shape. You can see on the finished lantern that a lot of the darkest shadows are just coming from a combination of 2 or 3 colors. And just how all of these things layer and work together to create a whole. And then the text will be done in magic marker so that it is a kind of a different part of the lantern. It has a different quality that really stands out. The text is going to be done not with the tissue paper, but with this marker that we've included in your kit. I recommend writing out all of the letters of your text, making sure you don't have any typos, making sure you have enough room to fit everything. And you're just gonna marker in your text. So now we have a nice heavy beginning of our text. But that ends up being our final result of the color part of the project.
We're almost done with the building of the lantern. So we're gonna now wanna cut a little window, like a little flap, so that we can allow the pole to go through, and then it'll allow us to reach in and insert the light. And again, being very cautious about how I'm cutting, I'm just gonna, it doesn't take much to cut through the tissue paper and the cheesecloth, so you don't need to apply a lot of pressure, but you just kind of want to follow, line up against the spacer. In your kit, you have one of these great little LED lights. And we don't need the elastic, so you could cut that off if you wanted to, but I'm just going to leave it on. And it has a little black switch. So really all I'm going to do is place the light on one of the spacers on one or the other side of the trap door. Of course, you want the light facing up, and keep in mind that you want the switch on closer to the door so you can turn the light on and off easily. Doing that, and then I have a little bit of a flap on either side so that I can then gently place the light and give it, just sort of put a little pressure on the tape and make sure it's holding well. If you want to look in and go over with another piece of tape, you can. So then we want to go to the other side. I can see my spacer and my other spacer. So I'm going to cut another little flap, trap door. Very easy to cut. And then I can just let that hang. I have my bamboo pole. And in your kit, you will find 2 pieces of wire. One of those pieces, we're gonna make a hook on the top of the bamboo. So I'm gonna fold it in half. It's thin enough that I can just fold it easily with my fingers. And then fold it into half again. I'm just gonna make a little, simple little hook. And then I'm gonna just, with my packing tape, tape it around the top of the bamboo. And I find it helpful to just apply the tape to the hook, and I'm pulling it super tight. So then, how do we hang the lantern? We're gonna create a little, like a clothes hanger here, but it's a lantern hanger, with this wire. So I'm gonna eyeball the midpoint, and around my finger, I'm gonna make a little loop, and then I'm gonna just twist maybe twice around. And then we're gonna stretch that across the top of the lantern. And for that, we need to make 2 little holes. I always find it helpful to just do a little dot, and I'm making just a teeny tiny little hole. There we go. So I have 1 in, and I'm gonna bring the end of the wire up, maybe push it down. Just make sure that the end of the wire is not poking out in a way that will hurt someone. Flip the lantern over, find my center point, a little slit, and just wrap it around a couple of times. And then I take my bamboo and I can slide it all the way through and hook it onto the little loop. Now we have a lantern.
So thank you so much for being part of this process. We know we've asked you to do a lot to get these lanterns ready, but it's going to be so worth it when people see them actually out on the street and when they all come together in digital form for the final video. We really miss you. We hope we will see you next year. The Morningside Lights workshops have become, for us as performance artists and as processional artists, a really important part of our annual year. And we're so sorry that we can't be with you in person this year, but we will be with you in spirit and in every other way so that all of this work can come together to bring Langston Hughes' poem to life and also to keep the great tradition of Morningside Lights going indefinitely into the future. Bye.
Bye.